In the early 1950s, there was a separatist movement in Puerto Rico that attempted to assassinate Harry Truman. Today, on Roundtable Perspective, Dr. Margaret Power joins me to talk about Puerto Rican history. We look at the separatist movement, the period of colonization, the movement for statehood, the economic disaster after 2008, and also, of course, the hurricane. Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined by my guest today, Dr. Margaret Power. We're going to talk about Puerto Rico from a historian's perspective and look at where they are now after the hurricane in 2017 and how that fits with their history leading up to this. Welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
Very good. So let's go to this. What is your assessment of Puerto Rico's attitude towards the U.S. right now? They started out as a colony. They were trying to achieve statehood at one point, and then we sort of gave them a cold shoulder after the hurricane. What's your assessment of things right now?
I think it's very difficult to gauge. I think on the one hand, many people in Puerto Rico were understandably distressed, upset, very angry at the treatment that was demonstrated to them personally by President Trump when he came and had the audacity to throw paper towels at people who lacked electricity, lacked food, lacked water, lacked the hope that they would get those things. Yeah. And still, months later, it is now about 10 months later, there are still people without electricity. And I think to step back for a moment and think, what does it mean to have no electricity in the world we live in today for something like 8 to 10 months for people? And I just got an email from a friend in Puerto Rico today. His electricity is out again. So it's an ongoing, recurring problem because the basic infrastructure has not been adapted. It was weak to begin with, and it has not been adapted to suit a tropical climate, and we're heading directly into a hurricane season. So what is the attitude of people in Puerto Rico? I think it varies. There are some people who think if we become a state, maybe they'll treat us better. I don't know if that's true or not. There are some people who think, well, look, it's completely obvious that even though we're part of the United States, they do not treat us equally. I think it's best to go for national sovereignty. And if at least we have sovereignty, then we can set up the rules. We can determine what happens in Puerto Rico. So exactly where people's political sympathies lie at this point, I believe, are a bit in flux.
And I guess they have been for a long time because there's always been a nationalist party, even when the statehood campaign was going on, right?
Yes. At this point, I'd say probably one of the most popular figures in Puerto Rico, though, is the mayor of San Juan, Carmen Yulín Sanchez, who is, I believe, possibly running for governor. She represents the Commonwealth Party, the Popular Democratic Party. And that's the party that is more for the continuation of the status quo. And yet you have a governor who supports statehood. So that's, to me, sort of in the two most important political figures in Puerto Rico, you have a representation of the fact that people aren't voting in a single party line.
So when you say she wants to maintain the status quo, that's what then?
Well, Puerto Rico was, and for many people, including me, still considered a U.S. colony, not a territory, not a commonwealth, because if you think of it, there's nothing in the U.S. Constitution that sets up the provisions for the functioning of a territory or whatever that doesn't exist within the U.S. Constitution as such. So what does it mean that you are a citizen of Puerto Rico? And if you live in Puerto Rico, you have no right to vote in any federal election. So all the people who live on the island of Puerto Rico, or the islands of Puerto Rico, cannot vote for president, cannot vote for senator, cannot vote for any federal official whatsoever. Yet they are considered U.S. citizens. If the moment they move to to the United States, then they vote. So you saw, for example, after the hurricane, an influx of something like over 100,000 Puerto Ricans to the state of Florida, potentially going to shift the political outcome in Florida because of their political sympathies.
Right. And there are actually more Puerto Ricans in the U.S. than there are in Puerto Rico.
Exactly,
is that right?
There are. Yeah, the balance has shifted and is continuing to, will continue to shift in that way. There are a million more here, a million plus more here in the United States, and actually it's probably growing because the devastation continues in Puerto Rico.
Yeah. When we say a million more here, is that a million people that were born in Puerto Rico, or is it just a million people of Puerto Rican heritage?
Well, it's both.
Yeah. Okay.
Since so many people have been migrating to the United States.
Yeah.
And especially in the recent period, since the economic, what preceded the the hurricane was the economic disaster. So economic disaster, then the hurricane disaster, which has meant you've had a lot of people leaving Puerto Rico, and specifically you've had a massive brain drain of the more educated professional class is leaving Puerto Rico because they cannot find positions commensurate with their education or salaries that they can here. And
the movement to the separatist movement, essentially, right?
Yeah.
That dates back to the 1930s, I think, or before that.
Actually, Puerto Rico was a Spanish colony, so beginning in 1868, there was an uprising in Puerto Rico simultaneous with an uprising with Cuba, which was also the two remaining Spanish colonies in the Americas. And they worked together in the 1800s. They've continued to have a very close relationship to the present day. They rose up against Spain, and what's interesting, they simultaneously wanted to achieve independence and end slavery, which is what had happened previously in Haiti.
Yeah.
Then, after the United States invaded Puerto Rico, there was a sense that we will get more autonomy.
And we invaded Puerto Rico during the Spanish-American War, right?
Yes, exactly,
Yeah.
1898.
Yeah.
And actually, July 25th, 1898, the United States invaded Puerto Rico. But the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party, which is what I'm particularly focusing on and do research on, started in 1922.
Okay.
And there has been ebbs and flows in the strength of the independence movement. So in the 1930s, during the Depression, there was a strong sentiment for independence in Puerto Rico. Then with the late 1940s, early 1950s, that ebbed, and Puerto Rico, it's at that point that Puerto Rico became what it is now, a free associated state, which, again, what does that mean to be a free associated state?
Yeah.
They had revised the Constitution, and actually,
the United States really went out of its way to make it look like they weren't a colony, right? Because we were supporting, an end of colonialism around the world after World War II, but yet here we were hanging on to this territory off the coast of Florida, right? Right,
and it was very important because the United States posed itself as the opposite of the Soviet Union, as the beacon of democracy, yet it had a colony.
Yeah.
And it was particularly important because in the late 1940s, right after the United Nations had formed, because many Latin American nations had a particularly strong presence in the United Nations and were more, at different points, more or less supportive of supporting independence for Puerto Rico. So
right.
it was also a way of appeasing national sentiment, global sentiment, in terms of anti-colonialism.
Yeah, so the U.S. then allowed them to elect a governor, essentially, right? And,
right, for the first time in 1948.
Yeah. But there was this solidarity movement in Latin America at the time.
Yes.
And so one of the reactions, I understand, within Puerto Rico was the separatist movement actually got a little more vocal, and there was a gunfight at the Harry Truman residence, right?
Yeah. Well, what happened in 1950, the Nationalist Party realized that the Puerto Rican government, in conjunction with the U.S. government, was moving towards setting up the free associated state. And they interpreted this as meaning the death knell to the chances of Puerto Rico becoming an independent nation. So on October 30th, 1950, they staged an uprising in Puerto Rico. in which they took over, they fought in 7 towns. They attacked the governor's mansion in San Juan, and they held on to two towns, one of them Jayuya, all of these towns in the mountainous interior of Puerto Rico, for 48 hours. And actually, the U.S. government sent in planes to strafe the town of Jayuya and Utuada, another town there. And then following that, they rounded up over 1,165 Puerto Ricans. There were members of the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party who at that time were living in New York City, and they determined that the whole press in the United States, or the media in general, were presenting the issue in Puerto Rico as a civil war. Puerto Ricans are fighting Puerto Ricans, whereas for them it was Puerto Rico versus the United States. So they determined that the best way to grab international attention was by staging a somewhat sensationalist act, we could say. So they traveled from New York to Washington, and they went to Blair House, which right across from the White House. So Blair House
was a residence that
there were
Truman
repairs
was in
were going on in the White House, so Truman was there. So they went there, and their plan was to attack Blair House, assassinate Truman. It didn't happen, obviously, as I think is no news to anybody. One of them got killed. Another one of them.
Actually, there was just it was a gunfight with the guards at the door, essentially.
Right, they didn't make it in.
Yeah.
And then the one who survived, Oscar Collazo, was given the death penalty. At that point, those who were in support of the Nationalist Party and of Puerto Rico and wanted to save his life mobilized a global campaign, a lot of which took place throughout Latin America, where they had had strong connections since the 1920s. So heads of state, intellectuals, artists, trade unions, students' organizations wrote letters, signed petitions, wrote cablegrams to President Truman asking him to spare his life. And I found a memo actually from Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State, saying to Harry Truman that it would be a good idea, actually. It would play well to spare his life, to not give the death penalty, but to give him life imprisonment, which President Truman did, which to me is a sign of the importance of people acting, of people saying, yes, signing a name, making a call now, or sending an email now, but back then, a different means of communication. It matters, it saved his life, and it also showed the importance of Latin America.
Yeah, interesting. And the movement in Puerto Rico was very close with the movement in Cuba, wasn't it?
Yes.
And I think that's interesting because the Cuban Revolution was really actually not happening yet, right? It was things were moving more slowly in Cuba.
When?
During this period.
Oh,
right?
during this period. Yeah. Interestingly enough, after some of the Puerto Ricans who were arrested, some of them then went into exile in Cuba, and the leader of the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party, Pedro Albizu Campos, was married to a Peruvian woman, Laura Meneses. Hope this will not get confusing, but anyway, she was in Cuba.
There'll be a test later on, ladies and gentlemen.
Test later on, so remember those names.
Yeah, okay.
And she was in exile in Cuba along with another leader of the Nationalist Party. This was in 1950. And so were other Puerto Ricans who went into exile there. They were in contact with the student movement in Cuba and Fidel Castro. And in fact, Fidel Castro organized a demonstration in front of the U.S. Embassy in Havana, Cuba, calling for the liberation of the Puerto Rican nationalist prisoners. So there were very deep connections. And then they met up again, Laura Meneses and this other one, Warbe, met up again in Mexico City, right where Fidel Castro went, along with Che Guevara, after Fidel Castro was released from prison. And then they actually became very close there. And then after the revolution, Laura Meneses went to Cuba and lived in Cuba because she had been stripped of her citizenship.
Yeah. Yeah, and which is kind of contrary to the relationship with the rest of Latin America, right? I think you you mentioned in one of your articles. By the way, Margaret has several articles on Puerto Rico. Her most recent one in 2015, I think, right? and two or three others on
probably
the
some more.
Something more after that too. Okay.
Probably.
But you did mention that they've sort of been disassociated to some extent with the rest of Latin America. That they're not always included in people looking at the Latin American experience and stuff.
Right.
Do you want to address that a little bit?
Yeah, I think what happened is the United States was very effective in its propaganda of saying that Puerto Rico's not a colony, Puerto Rico is part of the United States, and therefore it's not part of not part of Latin America anymore. Yet, what's interesting, I don't know if people have noticed this, but Puerto Rico has its own Olympic team. And Puerto Rico has its a contestant in the Miss Universe pageant. So there are these little streaks of Puerto Rico is not really it's part of the United States, but it's not part of the United States, etc. So many people in Latin America have not always understood the relationship. Yet, at the same time, for example, there were these 11 and then 13, up to 15 Puerto Ricans who were arrested here in the United States beginning in 1980. One of them, who just got released, Oscar Lopez Rivera, in 2017, last year. So there was tremendous solidarity from throughout Latin America demanding that the presidents release him from well-known figure throughout Latin America. So I think it's been very mixed.
Is there a chance that because Puerto Rico's military importance is less significant now, perhaps that the United States would be willing to walk away and grant independence?
I cannot predict anything that our current government will do.
Right.
So I'm not sure.
That.
that would be a tough one.
Well, what about the potential for statehood then?
I think that is easier to predict. I think there is a great unlikelihood that this current administration or a Republican-dominated Congress would want Puerto Rico, which is a Spanish-speaking state made up of Latino population, who primarily leans Democratic, coming into the country.
Well, let's just say we had let's say the Obama administration is still in power, right?
Yeah.
What would be their chances if we just looked at it sort of objectively? I mean, what would be considered pluses and minuses for that?
For Puerto Ricans or for the United States?
For Puerto Rico being, well, from the United States standpoint, yeah.
Well, for the United States standpoint, Puerto Rico still right now, what's happening in Puerto Rico is that basically a U.S. government-appointed body has taken over the economic running of Puerto Rico, which means basically that Puerto Rico is being opened up to, it always has, but it's been in an even deeper way, to massive U.S. investment, so that people from this country are looking at Puerto Rico as the place to make investments in building up resorts, because it's part of the United States, in investments, in investment capital, because you have an educated and trained working class that will work, and not justifiably, but that does work because unemployment is so high, that will work for lower wages. So on one level, it's almost as having you have your third world colony right there, which is part of the United States. You don't need to go through any red tape whatsoever. Right. That would be a plus to the United States, I think, to the United States economic capitalist class.
But of course, we have that opportunity whether they're granted statehood or not, right? So really, I don't see the incentive.
I don't see the incentive.
Yeah.
I don't see it.
Was there a time when there was some incentive for the U.S., do you think?
No, I don't. I mean, maybe there are people who have different opinions. I'm sure there are people who have different opinions. See, yes, there is an incentive. I suppose the only incentive would possibly be a moral one, to say that actually, since we fought for independence from Britain because we didn't believe in taxation without representation, right, we don't want to be such hypocrites and do the same thing to Puerto Rico that we fought against. But I don't really see that in the cards right now. That doesn't seem to be what's happening.
Well, an interesting sidelight too is that they don't pay federal income tax unless they're working for an American company. Is that right?
Yeah, except they do pay tax. Say anytime you buy anything in Puerto Rico, you pay taxes.
Yeah.
So there are taxes. I mean, that's a bit of a myth. But for example, it also means, here are two things that I think are really interesting. When Puerto Rico lost power, different countries in Latin America, Venezuela being one of them, said, we will ship in oil to run the generators.
Right.
The United States government under President Trump said, you have a 7-day window of opportunity to get your tankers in. That wasn't happening. It couldn't happen. You could mobilize the tankers, get them to Puerto Rico and back in 7 days, which means...
So we weren't letting them in?
No, the United States was not letting them in. Venezuela said, we will send you oil. The United States government would not let them in. Anything that goes into Puerto Rico that comes from a non-U.S. ship has to first be unloaded, then loaded back onto a U.S. ship. It's this special law, which means that so President Trump was going to drop that law for 7 days. That's the law that was going to be dropped, which means that anything that goes in and out of Puerto Rico has to go basically through Florida, which adds extra prices. So anything you get in Puerto Rico is going to be more expensive than the same item you get in the United States because of that law, because of transportation. And to me, it's just symptomatic. The other thing is, because of Puerto Rico's status, it cannot declare bankruptcy. So say a city in the United States can declare bankruptcy, but the island of Puerto Rico, which is in massive debt, which will never be able to pay back its debt, cannot declare bankruptcy because of U.S. laws. So U.S. laws directly intercede with the economy of Puerto Rico, and the way it benefits, in a sense, if anybody's read the shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein, talks about how when you have a system in crisis, a disaster, then that's a really great opening for people who want to make profits to go in there and take advantage of the crises to make profits.
Yeah,
and which is exactly, I think carpetbaggers is a misnomer, actually. Yeah. But because I think a lot of the people who went from the north to the south after slavery ended went because they wanted to help the former slaves. And I think they become known as carpetbaggers as a way to disparage white people from the north who supported slaves.
No, you're the historian here, so
well,
please set it straight.
I grew up thinking of people as carpetbaggers as well. So,
but at any rate, people going in to take advantage of those who were
and because now the people going in are the people who have the economic power. They run the show. So in a sense, the gates have been opened even wider. Maybe we could think of it that way. Yeah.
Well, and so you make the economy in Puerto Rico sound like it's in pretty bad shape.
It's in really bad shape. I think there's something like 43% unemployment. I could be wrong. You know, I don't always completely remember figures, and I don't remember but let's say extremely high.
Yeah. And like, how did they, I mean, has it always been that high? Has it been in decline? What's the trajectory there?
Since 2008, and since the economic crisis has hit Puerto Rico, everything's just plunging. Basically, the unemployment figures have risen. Mm-hmm.
So before 2008, what did Puerto Rico, what did the economy have going for it? What were its strengths? Tourism.
Well, tourism, yes, but up into it was the major center for U.S. pharmaceutical companies. For example, the U.S. pharmaceutical companies not only had less strict environmental laws in Puerto Rico because it's a colony, so they can do what they want, they also were able to use Puerto Rican people as human guinea pigs, basically. So the birth control pill, for example, was tested on Puerto Rican women, and nowadays people think, no big deal, birth control pill. But when the birth control pill was first being developed and then marketed, they had incredibly high levels of high numbers of risk with it, which meant that a lot of Puerto Rican women were subjected to testing. And concomitant with that was this incredible push to sterilize Puerto Rican women, so that Puerto Rican women at one point, Puerto Rican women between childbearing age, had the highest levels of sterilization in the entire world. It ranged between 30 to 40, maybe even 50% of Puerto Rican women of childbearing age because the United States government thought was, there are too many of them, let's get rid of them. And here's something interesting. Just on the way down here, I heard the news, and I'm not sure if anybody heard this, but a woman was walking in one of the Cook County Forest Preserves wearing a Puerto Rican t-shirt. And some man came up to her and started yelling at her and said, "Get out of this country, you don't belong here."
Interesting, yeah.
Yeah.
And yet we're telling them that they're citizens, right?
Right.
Well, we've had a very complicated relationship with Puerto Rico over the
Yes.
years, I guess, but in some ways not so complicated. It's
Exactly.
a dominant country
Yes.
in a country that's been unable to be in control of its own destiny. Right?
Right.
Well, that's all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Margaret Power for joining today in the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. I'll see you next time.